Good evening, friends. I am here with chapter 3 of The Indian in the Cupboard. So tonight, before I get started, I want to go ahead and set our purpose for reading. So to give you something to think about while I'm reading. So how did Omri feel after he found out that Little Bear had killed 30 people? We're going to find out Little Bear killed 30 people. How would that make you feel if you were Omri? So maybe put your feet in his shoes and think about how that would make you feel. Chapter 3 is called 30 Scalps. Within a few minutes, loud snores, well, not loud, but loud for the Indian, began to come out of the teepee. But Omri, sleepy as he was himself, was not quite ready for bed. He had an experiment to do. As he had figured it out so far, the cupboard, or the key, or both together, brought the plastic things to life, or if they were already alive, turned them to plastic. There were a lot of questions to be answered, though. Did it only work for plastic? Say, would a wooden or metal figure also come to life if shut up in the cupboard? How long did it have to stay there for the magic to work? Overnight, or did it happen right away? And another thing, what about objects? The Indian's clothes, his feather, his knife, all had become real. Was this just because they were part of the original plastic figure? If he put, anything you like, the despised plastic teepee, for instance, into the cupboard and locked that in the door, would that become real in the morning? And what would happen to a real object if he put it in? He decided to make a double trial. He stood the plastic Indian tent on a shelf of the cupboard. Beside it, he put a matchbox car. Then he closed the cupboard door. He didn't lock it. He counted slowly to 10. Nothing had happened. He closed the door again, and this time locked it with his great-grandmother's key. He decided to give it a little bit longer this time, and while he was waiting, he lay down in bed. He began counting to 10 slowly. He got roughly as far as 5 before he fell asleep. He was awakened at dawn by Little Bear bawling at him. The Indian was standing outside the felt teepee on the edge of the table, his hands cupped into his mouth as if he was shouting across a measureless canyon. As soon as Omri's eyes opened, the Indian shouted, "Day come! Why you still sleep? Time eat, hunt, fight, make pictures." Omri leapt up. He cried, "Wait!" and almost wrenched the cupboard open. There on the shelf stood a small teepee made of real leather. Even the stitches on it were real. The poles were twigs tied together with a strip of hide. The designs were real Indian symbols, put on with bright dyes. The car was still a toy car made of metal, no more real than it had ever been. "Works," breathed Omri, and then he caught his breath. "Little Bear," he shouted. "It works! It works! I can make any plastic toy I like come alive, come real! It's real magic! Don't you understand? Magic!" The Indian stood calmly with his arms folded, evidently disapproving of this display of excitement. "So, magic? The spirits work much magic. No need to wake dead with howls." Omri hastily pulled himself together. Never mind the dead. It was his parents he must take care not to wake. He'd picked up the new teepee and set it down near the one he had made the night before. "Here's the good one I promised you," he said. Little Bear examined it carefully. "No good," he said at last. "What? Why not?" "Good teepee, but no good Iroquois brave. See?" He pointed to the painted symbols. "Not Iroquois signs. Algonquin. Little Bear sleep there. Iroquois spirits angry." "Oh," said Omri, disappointed. "Little Bear like Omri teepee. Need paint. Make strong pictures. Iroquois signs. Please spirits." Omri's disappointment melted into intense pride. He had made a teepee that satisfied his Indian. It's not finished, he said. I'll take it to school and finish it in handicrafts lesson. I'll take out pins and sew it properly. Then when I come home, I'll give you poster paints and you can paint the signs. I paint, but must have longhouse. Teepee no good for Iroquois. Just for now? Little Bear scolded. Yes, but very short. Now eat. Yes. What do you like to eat in the mornings? Meat, the Indian said immediately. Wouldn't you like some bread and cheese? Meat. Or corn? Or some eggs? The Indian folded his arms uncompromisingly across his chest. Meat, said Omri with a sigh. Well, yes, I'll have to see what I can do. In the meantime, I think I better put you down on the ground. Not on ground now? No, you're high above the ground. Go to the edge and look, but don't fall. The Indian took no chances. Lying on his stomach, he crawled, commando fashion, to the edge of the chest of drawers and peered over. Big mountain, he commented at last. Well, but it seemed too difficult to explain. May I lift you down? Little Bear stood up and looked at Omri measuringly. Not hold tight, he asked. No, I won't hold you tight at all. You can ride in my hand. He laid his hand palm next to Little Bear, who, after only a moment's hesitation, stepped onto it and, for greater stability, sat down cross-legged. Omri gently transported him to the floor. The Indian rose lithely to his feet and jumped off the once gray carpet. At once he began looking about with suspicion. He dropped down to his knees, felt the carpet, and smelled it. Not ground, he said. Blanket? Little Bear, look up. He obeyed, narrowing his eyes and peering. Do you see the sky or the sun? The Indian shook his head, puzzled. That's because we're not outdoors. We're in a room, in a house big enough for people. You're not even in America. You're in England. The Indian's face lit up. English good. Iroquois fight with English against French. Really? Omri asked, wishing he had read more. Did you fight? Fight. Little Bear, fight like mountain lion. Take many scalps. Scalps? Omri swallowed. How many? Little Bear proudly held up all 10 fingers. Then he closed his fist, opening them again with another lot of 10, and then another. I don't believe you killed so many people, said Omri, shocked. Little Bear not lie. Great hunter, great fighter. Any white scalps? Omri ventured to ask. Some, French. Not take English scalps. Englishmen friends to Iroquois. Help Indian fight Algonquin enemies. Excuse me. Omri stared at him. He suddenly wanted to get away. I'll go and get you some meat, he said in a choking voice. He went out to his room, closing the bedroom door behind him. For a moment he did not move, but he leaned back against the door. He was sweating slightly. This was a bit more than he had bargained for. Not only has his Indian come to life, but he was a real person, somehow magicked out of the past over 200 years ago. It occurred to Omri for the first time in his life that his idea of Indians, taken entirely from Western films, had been somehow false. After all, those had all been actors playing Indians, and afterwards they would wipe off their war paint and go home for their dinners, not in teepees, but in houses like this. Little Bear was no actor. Omri swallowed hard. 30 scalps. Phew. Of course, things were different in those days. Those tribes were always making war on each other. And when you come to think of it, the English and French, whatever they thought they were doing, fighting in America, were probably no better, killing each other like mad as often as they could. Even now, weren't soldiers doing the same thing? Weren't there wars and battles and terrorism going on all over the place? You couldn't switch on the television without seeing about people being killed. Were 30 scalps, even including some French ones taken hundreds of years ago, so very bad at all? Still, when he tried to imagine Little Bear, full size, bent over some French soldier holding his hair in one hand and running the point of his scalping knife, yuck! Omri pushed away from the door and walked rather unsteadily down the stairs. No wonder he had felt, from the first, slightly afraid of his Indian. He asked himself, swallowing repeatedly and feeling that just the same he might be sick, whether he wouldn't do better to put Little Bear back in the cupboard, lock the door, and turn him into plastic, knife and all. Down in the kitchen, he ransacked his mother's store cupboard for a tin of meat. He found some corned beef at last and opened it with the tin opener on the wall. He dug out a chunk of it with a teaspoon, put it absently into his own mouth, and stood there chewing it. The Indian hadn't seemed very surprised about being in a giant house in England. He had shown that he was very superstitious, believing in magic, and in good and evil spirits. Perhaps he thought of Omri as, well, some kind of genie, or whatever Indians believed in instead. The wonder was that he wasn't more afraid of him, for genies, or giants, or spirits, or whatever, were always supposed to be very powerful. Omri supposed that if one happened to be the son of an Indian chief, one simply didn't get scared as easily as ordinary people, especially, perhaps, if one had taken 30 scalps. Maybe Omri ought to tell someone about Little Bear. The trouble was that, although grown-ups usually knew what to do, what they did was very seldom what the children wanted to be done. What if they took the Indian to, say, some scientist, or whoever knew about strange things like that, who would question him and examine him and probably keep him in a laboratory or something of that sort? They would certainly want to take the cupboard away too, and then Omri wouldn't be able to have any more fun with it at all. Just when his mind was seething with ideas, such as putting in plastic bows and arrows and horses and maybe even other little people, well, no, probably that was too risky. Who knew what sort of land you might end up with? They might start fighting each other. But still, he knew for a second he did not want to give up his secret. Not yet, no matter how many Frenchmen had been scalped. Having made his decision, for the moment anyway, Omri turned to go upstairs, discovering only halfway up that the tin of corned beef was practically empty. Still, there was a fair-sized bit left in the bottom. It ought to do. Little Bear was nowhere to be seen, but when Omri called him softly, he ran out from under the bed and stood waving both arms up at Omri. "Bring meat?" Yes. Omri put it on the miniature plate he had cut the night before, and placed it before the Indian, who seized it in both hands and began to gnaw on it. "Very good. Soft. Your wife cooked this?" Omri started to laugh. "I haven't got a wife." The Indian stopped to look at him. "Omri not got wife? Who grow corn, grind, cook, make my clothes?" "My mother," said Omri, still grinning. "Have you got a wife, then?" The Indian looked away. After a moment he said, "No." "Why not?" "Dead," said Little Bear shortly. "Oh." The Indian finished eating in silence, and then stood up, wiping his greasy hands on the side of his trousers. "Now, do magic. Make things for Little Bear. What do you want?" "Gun," he answered promptly. "White man's gun, like English soldier." Omri's brain raced. If a tiny knife could stab, a tiny gun could shoot. Maybe it couldn't do much harm, but then again, maybe it could. "No, no gun, but I can make you a bow and arrows. I'll have to buy plastic ones, though. What else? A horse?" "Horse?" Little Bear seemed surprised. "Don't you ride? I thought all Indians rode." Little Bear shook his head. "Iroquois walk." "But wouldn't you like to ride?" Little Bear stood quite still, frowning, wrestling with this novel idea. At least he said, maybe. Show horse. Then I see. Again Omri rummaged in the biscuit tin. There were a number of horses here. Big, heavy ones for carrying armored knights, smaller ones for pulling gun carriages in the Napoleonic Wars, several cavalry horses. Those might be best. Omri ranged 5 or 6 of various sizes and colors before Little Bear, whose black eyes began to shine. I have, he said promptly. You mean all of them? Little Bear nodded hungrily. No, that's too much. I can't have herds of horses galloping all over my room. You can choose one. One, Little Bear said sadly. One. Little Bear then made a very thorough examination of every horse, feeling their legs, running their hands over their rumps, looking straight into their plastic faces. At last he selected a smallish brown horse with 2 white feet that had originally, as far as Omri could remember, carried an Arab brandishing a curved sword at a platoon of French Foreign Legionnaires. Omri lifted the cupboard onto the floor, shut the horse in, and turned the key. Almost at once they could hear the clatter of tiny hoofs on the metal. They looked at each other with joyful faces. Open! Open door! Commanded Little Bear. Omri lost no time in doing it. There, prancing and pawing at the white paint, was a lovely, shining coated little brown Arab horse. As the door swung open, he shied nervously, turning his face and prickling his ears so far forward that they almost met over his forelock. His tiny nostrils flared, and his black tail plumed over his haunches as he gave a shrill neigh. "Aye!" cried Little Bear. In a moment he had vaulted over the bottom edge of the cupboard, and as the horse reared in fright, jumped into the air, and then, under its flying hoofs, grasped the leather reins. The horse fought to free its head, but Little Bear hung on with both hands. Even as the horse plunged and bucked, the Indian had moved from the front to the side, grasping the high pommel of the saddle. He swung himself into it. He ignored the swinging stirrups, holding it by gripping his knees. The horse flung himself back on his haunches and then threw himself forward in a mighty buck, head low, heels flying. To Omri's dismay, Little Bear, instead of clinging on somehow, came loose and flew through the air in a curve, landing on the carpet just beyond the edge of the cupboard. Omri thought his neck must be broken, but he landed in some sort of somersault and was instantly on his feet again. The face turned Omri with happiness. "Crazy Horse!" he cried with fierce delight. The Crazy Horse was meanwhile standing still, reins hanging loose, looking watchfully at the Indian through wild, wide-apart eyes. Little Bear made no sudden moves. He stood quiet for a long time, just looking back at the horse. Then, so slowly you could scarcely notice, he edged toward him, making strange hissing sounds between his clenched teeth that almost seemed to hypnotize the horse. Inch by inch he moved, slowly, cautiously, until he and the horse stood almost nose to nose. Then, quite calmly, Little Bear reached up and laid his hand on the horse's neck. That was all. He did not hold the reins. The horse could have jumped away, but he didn't. He raised his nose a little, so that he and the Indian seemed to be breathing into each other's nostrils. Then, in a quiet voice, Little Bear said, "Now, horse mine, Crazy Horse mine." Still moving slowly, though not as slowly as before, he took the reins and moved alongside the horse. After a certain amount of fiddling, he found out how to unbuckle the straps that held the Arabian saddle, lifted it off, laying it on the floor. The horse snorted and tossed his head, but did not move. Hissing gently now, the Indian first leaned his weight against the horse's side, then lifted himself by his arms until he was astride. Letting the reins hang loose on the horse's neck, he squeezed with his legs. The horse moved forward as tame and obedient as you please, and the pair rode once around inside the cupboard as if it had been a circus arena. Suddenly Little Bear caught up the reins and pulled them to one side, turning the horse's head and at the same time kicking him sharply. The horse wheeled and bounded forward toward the edge of the cupboard. This metal rim was up to the horse's chest, like a 5-barred gate to a full-size horse. There was no room to ride straight at it, from the back of the cupboard to the front, so Little Bear rode diagonally, in a very difficult angle, yet the horse cleared it in a flying leap. Omri realized at once that the carpet was too soft for him. His feet simply sank into it like soft sand. "Need ground, not blanket," said Little Bear. "Blanket not good for ride." Omri looked at his clock. It was still only a little after 6 in the morning, at least another hour before anyone would be up. "I could take you outside," he said hesitantly. "Good," said Little Bear, "but not touch horse. You touch much fear." Omri quickly found a small cardboard box that held a matchbox glory. It even had the sort of window through which he could see what was happening inside. He laid that on the carpet with the ends flapped open. Little Bear rode the horse into the box, and Omri carefully shut the end up and even more carefully lifted it. Then in his bare feet he carried the box slowly down the stairs and let himself through the back door. It was a lovely, fresh spring morning. Omri stood on the back steps with the box in his hands, looking round for a suitable spot. The lawn wasn't much good. The grass would be over the Indian's head in most places. The terrace at the foot of the steps was no use at all, with its hard, uneven bricks and cracks between them. But the path was beaten earth and small stones, real riding ground if they were careful. Omri walked to the path and laid the matchbox carton down. For a moment he hesitated. Could the Indian run away? How fast could such a small horse run? As fast as, say, a mouse? If so, and they had wanted to escape, Omri wouldn't be able to catch them. A cat, on the other hand, would. Omri knelt on the path in his pajamas and put his face against the cellophane window. The Indian stood inside, holding the horse's head. "Little Bear," he said clearly, "we're outdoors now. I'm going to let you out to ride, but remember, you're not on a prairie now. There are mountain lions here, but they're big enough to swallow you whole, and the horse too. Don't run away. You wouldn't survive. Do you understand?" Little Bear looked at him steadily and nodded. Omri opened the flap, and the Indian and the horse stepped out into the morning sunlight. So, something we found out, and I don't know if anyone noticed this while I was reading the first 2 chapters, but we found out that this story is set in England, right? We found out the story is set in England. So, when they're talking about a biscuit tin, that's like a cookie tin. So there are going to be things that we might hear in this story that are unfamiliar to us because they say things differently in England and they call things different names. So just something to keep in mind, and I hope that you picked up on some of those words that might be different than the words we use. Now, our vocabulary word for this part is uncompromisingly. And in the story, it said the Indian folded his arms uncompromisingly across his chest. So think about what that could mean. Think about when he said that, what he was doing in the story. And remember, our question for this chapter is, how did Omri feel after he found out Little Bear had killed 30 people? And remember, I said, put yourself in Omri's shoes. How would you feel if you met someone who had killed 30 people? And then also find out what we learned about the people that he killed and when that happened. Have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow.